You're listening to Podcast Rockstars, the show helping business leaders become podcast legends. Now, here's your host, Dawn Lidwell.
Welcome back to Podcast Rockstars, the show that helps business leaders become podcasting legends. I'm your host, Dawn Lidwell, the founder of Lidwell Writing Services, and my special guest today is podcast consultant, systems strategist, and international speaker, Yann Ilunga. Yann helps consultants and business owners increase their exposure, attract more leads, and drive prospects to their pipeline by leveraging podcasting and using automated systems. Yann is the host of the Podcaster Lab, the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast, the Jazz Spotlight Podcast, and the Marketers Podcast. He has been featured in Forbes, Inc. Magazine, Entrepreneur Magazine, The Huff Post, and the Podcast Business Journal, and has presented keynote presentations at Podcast Movement. Yann is also the creator of the Podcast Growth Mastermind Facebook community, an online community that Forbes has dubbed as the podcast community to join. Today, Yann shares his knowledge on podcast guesting. We discuss simple strategies you can use to improve your interviewing skills, as well as tips on how to be a rock star guest on other podcasts. We also discuss how you can sell your products or services through podcast guesting without being overly pushy, as well as ways you can encourage your podcast guests to share their interview with their followers. So without further ado, here's Yann Ilunga. Yann Ilunga, welcome to Podcast Rockstars.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Dawn. I'm excited to be here. It's nice to put a voice to the picture, to your logo, because I realized that you and I have been connected, especially on Twitter, for quite some time. I remember seeing you on my Twitter feed.
Yeah, I think I've been kind of stalking you for a while.
Oh, okay. I guess that's my cue. Thanks for the interview.
So, just in case there are people out there that don't know who you are, how about you tell us a little bit about you, your shows, and how you got started in podcasting?
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be my pleasure to. Thanks, Don, for asking. So my name, as you said, is Yann Ilunga. As some listeners might have noticed, I have this funny macaroni accent, and that's because my mother tongue is Italian, and I come from the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. So yes, we do speak Italian in Switzerland, and I've been living in Finland for almost 8 years now. And I entered, or I should say stumbled really, into the podcasting space almost 5 years ago. And I'm a person, Don, I could literally listen to music from the moment I open my eyes in the morning and fall asleep to music. I'm that kind of a person. But for the first time, or probably the first time that I can remember, years ago, I was studying for some exam, I believe. I was doing my master's in communications. And for the first time, I was like, well, I wouldn't like to, somehow I don't feel like listening to music, but I still would like to have something in the background. So I wasn't really sure what that something would be. I did a quick Google search and I came across this thing, because back then for me it was a thing called podcasts. Of course, I had no idea what a podcast was. I just basically listened to one of the first results Google gave me. So thank you, Google. And I listened to that show and I was like, oh, really interesting. And especially the guest struck a chord with me. So then I looked into what he was doing, listened to his podcast, and then I said to myself, I think this is something I could do, because I had been thinking about doing my own thing after finishing my degree studies. And I said, well, I already have connections in the music space, because I was thinking, well, I can do a podcast, but who do I know who is interesting? I mean, yeah, I could interview my friends, but who would care? So I started to kind of think about my network of contacts, and I said, well, I am connected quite well in the jazz music space, because back in Switzerland, I worked at a jazz festival called Jazz Ascona for a few years. And because I speak Italian, French, German, English, and well, now some Finnish, I got to do interviews with artists using the different languages. So I said to myself, well, I already have the connections there. I think some of those people would probably agree to be interviewed by me. So that's where my first show, the Jazz Spotlight, got started from. And then as I was doing podcasting, I loved it. I was learning more and more about the medium. I was learning more about the online business space. And I said to myself, there is a problem here. And do you want to know what the problem was, Dawn?
What was that?
Was that the more I was learning from these people and the more I said to myself, wow, it would be so nice to have conversations with them. But the problem was that those people were marketers, entrepreneurs, best-selling authors. So they weren't people who would have made much sense to feature on a music podcast. So that's where my second show, the 360 Entrepreneur, was born. So I used that as a tool to basically achieve that, really network and grow my network of contacts in the music, in the business space. And then I hosted briefly another podcast, a collaboration with a community of Italian entrepreneurs. And now I host the Podcast Lab, which is my latest show, and it's really kind of my main show. And it's a podcast about podcasting, and I cover the topic in a way that is different compared to other shows because I share my advice. I have expert contributions in the form of audio snippets. I use sound bites, and sometimes I also run series of experiments on different podcasting related topics and then share everything I did from start to finish, including the results, so that listeners can learn from my mistakes or my successes. And if it's from my mistakes, then they can avoid making those mistakes. So as of today, the 360 Entrepreneur finished a couple of years ago after 230 episodes. So my shows now are the Podcast Lab and then the Jazz Spotlight, the original podcast I launched years ago.
And I was actually just listening to a couple of your episodes last night for the Podcasters Lab, and I noticed the different format, and I was like, oh, I wonder how that works.
Right, yeah. I can tell you it's a lot of fun, but I realized I like it because I feel that it allows me to express more of my creativity with the sound bites and all those kind of things. But at the same time, it means a lot more work post-production wise.
That's what I was thinking too about, all of the post-production stuff that would go into it and how much more extensive it would be.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I feel that show, it would be harder to outsource the post-production because of that creative aspect that I really want to pick the sound that I feel it's right for what I want the listener to experience while they're listening to that specific segment. And I feel that nobody would be able to kind of make that decision in a way than me.
So you do the post-production editing and everything yourself too then?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Amen. Yeah. Sometimes I can tell that, yeah, it's not always easy, but yeah, I like the fact that I can express my creativity. So that kind of comes with the territory, I think.
Yeah. I asked you to be on the show today so that we could talk about podcast guesting.
Mm-hmm.
And as I told you before we started recording, I personally believe that there are two sides to the podcast guesting coin. There's that part for the hosting and the part for the guest. So I thought we could start by talking about what could podcast hosts do to improve their interviewing skills?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question. I'm excited. And thank you, Radon, for asking it. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that when it comes to podcast interviews, it's really about the combination of what the host says and does and what the guest says and does. And oftentimes I hear people who say, the guest is the star of your show. And I say, well, I don't really agree with that statement, or at least not completely. I feel that the guest is the co-star of the show. So I feel that the guest and the host should share the spotlight, at least in my opinion.
And how would a host go about doing that?
Yeah, the first thing, I think that as hosts, we tend to sometimes be afraid in a way, especially for maybe interviewing somebody who is a big deal. So I'm not putting myself in that category. I always say I'm a regular guy. I think, Dawn, you may have heard me saying this or maybe see it in the Podcast Growth Mastermind Facebook group. But I've been sitting, for example, in front of Grammy Award winning artists, New York Times bestselling authors, top entrepreneurs. And some of those people told me that this was one of the best interviews I've ever done. And they also told me why. So I'm happy to share those quote unquote secrets with you. The thing I think each host should do is, first of all, obviously think about what you would like to discuss with the guest. And that's pretty self-explanatory. Everybody does that. But then I would also encourage you to, as you research the guest, you prepare for the interview. Maybe you listen to some of their past interviews, or if they haven't done any podcast interviews, you maybe read written interviews they have done. And for example, I've had the honor of being the very first podcast interview Didi Bridgewater made. And she told me that on the show. And she is, I think, 3 times Grammy Award winning artist. She's an icon in the jazz music space. And for example, when I interview people like that, I always make sure that I go and look for some interviews they have done, and I try to identify something they said that I find interesting, and I make sure that I incorporate that into my interview. So I may say, if I were to interview Dawn, for example, I would say, oh, I remember I heard you said this in an interview, and I was wondering, are you still thinking about things that way, or what are your thoughts right now? And oftentimes when using that approach, after the interview is finished, I realized that many guests told me, you were really prepared. I could tell because you went and you basically mentioned specific things I said in specific interviews. So as a host, I would invite everybody to do that. And then also not to be afraid to really share your advice, your thoughts. Because sometimes we think, well, I'm interviewing this person who's supposed to be a star, a guru, a best-selling author, whatever you want the person is. And we think, well, I don't really have much to add to the conversation. But remember, guests come and go, but you as the host are the common denominator. So you don't want to be just like a commodity that you can be replaced by somebody else and the outcome of your show would be the same. So be prepared, number one. Research your guest. And I also always like to try to surprise the guests. So for example, I may see, okay, this person is working on a book, or has a book coming out, or if it's an artist, has an album coming out. And if perhaps that wasn't the main focus on the interview, I make sure to bring that up toward the end of the interview. And they are always like, oh, wow, thank you so much for asking. Or if I see that somebody hosts a podcast, I may not bring that up necessarily during the interview, but then toward the end, I say, yeah, so I know you are the host of this specific podcast. Tell us more about what the show is all about. So the preparation, and then being happy and kind of having the guts in a way to share the spotlight with the guest. And then thirdly, surprise them, give them the floor in a way for a minute to really promote something they have coming up in a non-salesy way. I think really goes a long way. And I think that's what makes some interviews memorable. And for me, it's funny because some of the people I've interviewed, I felt that they were so approachable, so sociable, so laid back. And then even at conferences, I've met people who ask me, hey, you've interviewed this person. How did you pull that off? Because I've asked him or her 5 times and they always told me no. And I'm like, really?
Well, I love those tips because it does seem like some podcast hosts do not do enough of their own research into the guests. It's more, especially whenever they find the guest through, say, a Facebook group or something.
Right. Or even services that connect podcast hosts and guests, I feel.
Yeah. So I absolutely love that tip.
Well, and what you see what you just did here, Dawn, you exactly walked the walk. So you added your 2 cents. And I say 2 cents, and I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but I think that as hosts, we often think, well, what I have to say really doesn't add to the conversation, and we chase the next question when maybe sometimes, and I'm not saying that one has to share his or her 2 cents after every single question. Sometimes you just feel like, yeah, that was interesting, kind of, let's move on to the next point, and that's fine. But that shouldn't be how your podcast is, that basically the guest says something, you just praise him or her and move on to the next question. And one thing I would add, if it's okay with you, Don, is also to make sure to always leave some room for the quote unquote unexpected. Sometimes you may have 4 or 5 talking points you would like to cover with the guest, but then after the second talking point, you or the guest start touching upon something that becomes very, very interesting, is still relevant for the listener, because obviously we want the listener to get some value from the interview, but that somehow takes time from the talking points you thought to cover afterwards. So those that were supposed to come next. And it's okay. Maybe those talking points go out of the window, but you still make for a great interview. So that's also important to keep in mind, because I've done interviews in the past, Don, where it was maybe a 30-minute interview, and the host sends me the talking points or questions in advance, and it's like 20 questions. And in my head, I'm like, okay, so 30 minutes, 20 questions. If I speak really fast, that means that if the host wants to add something, he or she would have 15 seconds per question. And that, I think, paints the picture of what we are discussing here.
Right. And, I do create like an overview. Whenever I'm interviewing somebody, I create an overview, but I generally stick to about 4, maybe 3 questions, 3 big ones. That way I can leave that space there for the unexpected.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you did it well in our case of this interview, because you saw on my website. So I asked you, okay, what are the things you would like to cover? So you gave me already an idea. But the mistake I see some hosts make that also I think has a negative impact on the overall podcast listening experience, at least in my opinion, is that they just say, well, I want the interview to be a very spontaneous conversation, so I'm not going to send the questions in advance to the guest. The problem I have with that approach when I am the guest, Don, is that if, like you did, for example, you tell me, okay, I thought we could talk about this topic, and this is my target audience, or this is who's tuning in, you're giving me the information I need to make sure to make other mental notes or get pen and paper or use a project management tool to write that information down, so that if I want to share some examples, some case studies, I place them in the context that resonates the most with the audience who's tuning in. If you tell me, okay, my audience is made up of this type of people, then I make sure that I approach the topic at hand from a certain angle and I use a certain terminology. If on the other hand, the audience changes, I may still talk about the same topic, but the viewpoints I cover it from, or the examples I share, or even the terminology I share may be different. And I feel that when the hosts just think, well, it's going to be a spontaneous conversation, I'm not going to tell anything to the guest, they're doing a disservice to their listeners, because I don't like the feeling when an interview is finished, the host and myself say bye to one another, and then I'm like, oh, I should have said this thing. And I feel that, the reason why this happens is because the host didn't tell me anything, so I didn't have time to prepare properly.
Right. But on the flip side, like I have been on a couple of different podcasts as a guest before, and one of them have actually sent me the questions. And at that point in time, I felt like I needed to over prepare. So it also you know what I mean? So it can also kind of put a crunch on the creative, spontaneous aspect of a normal conversation.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, or I see your point there. And I mean, I've done it as a host. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but I've done it in the past, for example, at festivals where I've interviewed artists and I had literally 5 minutes to prepare, because first they said, no, we don't want to do the interview. And then, oh, okay, can we do it like now? And I'm like, can I have 5 minutes, please? So I did prepare, and I see what you're saying there, Don. And I think it definitely also comes with the experience. For example, for this interview, even if you hadn't told me anything at all in advance, I know my topics well enough, and I've been a guest long enough that I really know how to still do a good job. But I feel that especially if maybe we're interviewing somebody who may not have been much in front of a microphone, or maybe never, then we want to make sure that they feel as comfortable as possible. And also, for example, letting guests know that, like you actually did, Don, before we started recording, that you told me, yeah, that we have a team that does editing. So let the guest know that, yeah, there is editing. So no worries if you trip on your tongue or your sneeze or whatever, no worries that there is editing. I think that also helps putting or making the guest feel at ease, especially those who may not have had much experience with microphones, with radio, or with podcasts.
Yeah, I agree with that. So let's talk a little bit about being a guest. It seems to me like it's not uncommon for people to ask in the online communities about the best way to grow their audience. And obviously, one of the best ways is by being a guest on other shows. So what would you recommend to, let's put it in terms of a new podcast or a new podcast guest? What would you recommend to them on how to prepare for the interviews and things of that nature?
Yeah, I would say everything we've just covered up until now, only from the other side of the mic. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I mean, some of the things we've touched upon right now definitely are similar. Yeah, apply, exactly. And I mean, like preparation and those kind of things. But I think first and foremost, when one wants to be a podcast guest, so one wants to be interviewed by podcast hosts, one should ask oneself, okay, what is the outcome I would like to get from the interview? And the outcome or the kind of outcomes can be several. Like you said, maybe one wants to build buzz around his or her podcast. If somebody has a Facebook group like I do, for example, maybe the idea is to do a well enough job that some people go from listening to that show to joining your Facebook group. In some other cases, maybe that you have a new book coming out, so you want to build awareness around that. So there are different reasons why one may want to be a podcast guest. And I feel that oftentimes we lose sight of those. So we say, well, yeah, I kind of want to promote my show. But then when we are on the interview, we do basically, we talk about everything but our show. And then when we plug it in, there is a sort of disconnect. It's like, for example, if you and I, Don, made this this interview, and my goal is to promote my Jazz Spotlight podcast, which, by the way, isn't, but let's pretend that was the goal. If we were to do this entire interview and we talk about podcast interviews as hosts, as guests, and my main call to action is, hey, go listen to my music podcast, people would be like, what's wrong with this guy? Why is he talking about music when they've talked about podcasting for 20 minutes, for 30 minutes, for an hour? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And one has to decide, even though you may have different goals, you have to keep in mind that when people listen to podcasts, they often multitask, which means that they can't really take 3, 4, 5, 6 different actions, even though you would like them to take. And sometimes they aren't going to take even a single action. But if you want to increase the chances of them actually doing something after they've listened to you as a guest, then you have to say to yourself, okay, where do I want to put emphasis on this interview? Is it the Facebook group? Is it my podcast? Is it my website? Is it my consulting services? Is it discourse? Is it the book? Is it the fact that I'm speaking at this conference? Is it the fact that I'm going to be performing at this music festival and things of that nature? So I would say, in terms of being a guest, it really starts with that. What is the number one goal, I dare to say, you want to achieve by being interviewed by other people?
And I would actually add to that, I understand that a lot of people, especially new podcast guests may not put so much emphasis on their purpose for being on the show, whether it's to promote whatever course or whatever.
Mhm.
But in the same respect, there's a lot of people that put too much emphasis on the selling
Amen.
aspect.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. And oftentimes, okay, I'll share my personal experience that I think may resonate with some people. I have gotten clients, members of my Facebook group, podcast listeners, email subscribers, speakers for my virtual summit, people who bought the ticket for my virtual summit as a result of podcast interviews. In most cases, the one thing that people comment on about my podcast guest interviews, sure, it is about the fact that the interview was great and they really enjoyed the content and they're gonna implement the tips I shared. But first and foremost, they always talk about how easygoing, laid back I am and friendly. And then when I'm at conferences and people meet me in person, they tell me, you sound exactly like, or you are exactly like I thought you were going to be because of the podcast. So I think that's something that should tell people that even though your goal may be to, okay, I want to be, for example, I am a podcasting consultant. So I would love for somebody who's listening to this interview to hire me and become a client, but I'm not here to sell that. I'm here to provide value and alongside you, Don, as I said earlier on, to be the co-star of this episode. And if somebody think, okay, this guy has something useful to say, I don't mind his macaroni accent, or I find it funny, I find it whatever, and I just like his personality, then I know that those people are gonna naturally gravitate toward me. But if I'm here just pushing my own agenda, it's not gonna work. And especially if people listen to the show on a pretty regular basis, they're gonna realize that, hey, how come everybody who is a guest goes about things a certain way, and then this guy comes along and every answer is just mentioning his course.
Amen. It's about the know, like, and trust factor.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I have heard a lot of people, I want to use the word complain, but I don't think that's quite right. They comment on their podcast guests not promoting their own episodes.
Mm-hmm.
What would you recommend to help encourage guests to do that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to admit, Don, that I also don't understand why one would do an interview as a guest and not promote it. I mean, I understand if it, for example, Didi Bridgewater, who I mentioned early on, even though she or her team were gracious enough to share it anyways on social, and I was really happy about that, but I kind of wasn't really expecting them or her to do that. But if you are, let's say, a regular guy, and I pride myself of being a regular guy. I don't want to be any guru or something, even though I've gotten like labels from Inc. and Forbes and all that stuff is great. But I always say, I'm just a regular guy with this funny macaroni accent who is originally from Switzerland and who lives in Finland. So I personally, when I'm a guest, I always do a few things. So I do share the interview. I add it to my social media scheduler. I don't know if you've heard of the tool, Dawn. It's called Social Bee.
No, I haven't heard of that one.
Okay, it's similar to, I guess you've heard of Meet Edgar?
Yes.
Okay, so it's similar to that. And so that's what I do. So I do promote the interview on a regular basis, especially if the content, like in our case here, it's going to be relevant today, tomorrow, next week, next month, and even a couple of years from now. I'm still going to promote it that obviously automatically through Social Bee. And then I also add the link to the show notes page, to my press page. And sometimes I may even repurpose some of the content we shared, or if there was a very, very good golden nugget that came up, I may include it in an article or even mention it on one of my podcasts and things like that. So I quickly just wanted to say what I do as a guest. Now, to answer your question, Don, I think it's important for us as hosts to keep in mind one thing. First of all, we cannot force guests to promote the show. So even though it would be great if everybody would promote it like crazy, that isn't going to happen. And you don't want to be pushy, because I remember, I think I may have even taken a screenshot of that. There was somebody, I'm not going to mention the name, but there was somebody very, very big name in the online business space who was interviewed by just a regular guy. And this person basically sent him, well, I'm just going to say it's a he, let's call it Mr. X. They sent Mr. X an email to say, okay, the interview was published. If you want to share it, here's the link. And Mr. X didn't share it. And then these people sent another email basically to say, yeah, why didn't you share the interview? What is the point? Something, basically they started nagging him. And Mr. X actually took a screenshot and added to his blog, and not in a positive way. So that teaches us that we don't want to be pushy. What you want to do is make it as easy as possible for the guest to share it. So don't just send an email and say, well, the episode is online. Here's the link. Have a nice day. No. Look at the platforms the guest uses. So for example, if the guest is somebody who really uses Instagram, consider sending, when you send the email to let him or her know that the interview is available, add some attachments. You can attach to the email, you can share the link to a Dropbox folder, a Google Drive folder, whatever, but provide them with some marketing assets they can use. So if Instagram is his or her number one platform, then share an image or even a couple of images that are optimized for Instagram. You can use platforms like Wave or Headliner to create some audiograms. And if you see that the person is using Twitter, you can even use a tool called Click to Tweet to basically pre-write the tweets and then share them in the form of a link. So in other words, the guest gets your email, they see a sentence. I usually do like this. I write the tweet and then copy and paste it in the email. And then with Click to Tweet, it generates a link. So basically I take that link and I make the sentence I pasted in the email connected to that link, so that when the guest clicks on the link, his or her Twitter opens up with the tweet basically pre-written that I wrote, with the tweet, with the link to the show notes page, with the hashtags, and the guest only needs to enter username, password for Twitter, click tweet, and voila, the jeux sont faits, like what we say in French. So it would be very, very easy for the guest to share. And I've had some guests who told me, you make it almost impossible not to share. So do that for each guest. Send an email with some marketing assets. It can be images, it can be infographics, it can be clickable tweets, it can be whatever it is that you use. And then also consider tagging them on the different social media platforms. Personally, I would say don't post on publishing day, so the day the episode is published. Don't post and tag the guest on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Twitter, on Pinterest, and any other platform. Because if I'm a guest, and unfortunately I see this happening quite often, if I see the first, let's say, post I see, it's a tweet, I will favorite, retweet it, probably interact with it, thanking you for having me on the show, or whatever the case may be. But then if I see the same on Facebook, if I see the same on LinkedIn, I'm not going to have the same level of engagement. And I know that some people who follow me on Twitter also follow me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram. So I don't want them to be like, first on Twitter, they see my retweet, they're like, oh, nice, Yann was interviewed on this show. Then they see my reshare on Facebook, they're like, oh, yeah, right, Yann was interviewed for that show. Then they go to on LinkedIn and they see, yeah, okay, Yann, I got it. You were interviewed for that show. Then they go on Instagram and they're like, Yann, I got the message. You were interviewed on that show. What I would recommend doing is drip the way you go about things. So sure, you may post on all the platforms on publishing day, but tag or mention the guest only on one today, then on a different platform tomorrow, and so forth. So that also increases the chance of the guest then interacting with the specific post or tweet on that platform and maybe reshare it.
That is a fantastic tip. I actually would have been one of the ones that had tagged you in everything.
Well, hey, Dawn. Now you know it. It's on the record. No, and I'm honest about this. I also say to my clients sometimes, and it's unfortunate, but then what I'm sharing here with you, Dawn, and your listeners, it's also the same approach I have for my own podcast episodes or any article. If I publish an article today, I'm not going to post the exact same post on every single platform at the same time. I'm going to drip it out. So today I posted on my Facebook business page and I use a certain image. Then maybe tonight I posted on Twitter and I may use a different image or even a different copy. Then maybe tomorrow I posted on Instagram and so forth.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Great.
So, last question before we wrap up. What is one actionable strategy or tip that you would give to a brand new or aspiring podcaster?
Wow, that's a great question. I already have the answer, but may I basically ask you a question, Don, that would help me with my answer?
Sure.
Okay. Would this podcaster, the show he or she hosts, would it be a show potentially connected to his or her business or a podcast just for fun?
A business.
Perfect. Okay. I was kind of hoping you would say that. Well, so here's the thing. The mistake, and now it's funny because I was just talking about this on a client call right before I jumped on this interview with you, Don. And the mistake I often see, well, I say we because I also made it in the past, and is oftentimes we say, well, yeah, I have a business and I have a podcast and I want to connect it to my business. But then if somebody like me, for example, as a consultant, comes in as an outsider, dissects your podcast, dissects your business, and I find myself sometimes asking my consulting clients, and why did you decide to cover this topic? Or why are you using this podcast format? What are you trying to achieve? Because that's the key question. If you say, oh, okay, our goal with our podcast is to interview, is to find people who could be potential partners, for example, or who could be potential clients, then having an interview-based podcast makes perfect sense. But if you say our goal, let's say I'm a consultant or I'm a coach or somebody like along those lines, and my goal is to position myself as the go-to person in my space, then I'm not that sure that hosting or conducting interviews would be the best format, for the fact that, as we said a couple of times, when we do interviews, we basically star in the episode. So if you want to build authority, position yourself as an expert, being the main character, so hosting a solo show, may make more sense. So I would say, if you have a business and you are working on a podcast connected to the business, I would say this: when it comes to the format of your show, when it comes to the topic or topics you're going to cover, and when it comes to the call to actions you're going to have and the steps you would like listeners to take after they've listened to an episode or a series of episodes, is really think about your business and what you would like the podcast to achieve for your business. So, for example, in my case, as I told you, Don, why did I start a 360 Entrepreneur? Because I wanted to grow my network of contacts. Why? The answer is simple: because I knew that if I grow my network of contacts, I would have access to people that I could be an affiliate marketer for, who could help me by being affiliate marketers for some of my things, who could be speakers for my virtual summit, the Podcast Success Summit, and so on. But then with the Podcast Lab, I said to myself, well, I'm a podcasting consultant, so I talk about podcasting. So I really want to focus on the positioning of me as the main character. That's why I opted to go for a solo show. But I still realize that oftentimes when it comes to advice or certain topics, it's nice to have different viewpoints. It makes for a more enriching experience. So that's why for the Podcast Lab, I don't do interviews, but I still sometimes on some episodes have expert contributions in the form of comments, strategies that they send me as audio and I plug into the episode. But I've always been very specific with basically what I want my podcast or podcasts to do for me, for my business. So I would invite you, Dawn, as well as everybody who's been here with you and I, to really think about this and always keep their business at the back of their mind and not just think, well, everybody does interviews. I want to do interviews as well. And I want to interview New York Times bestselling authors. Well, that can be interesting. But if you are looking to use your podcast as an asset for your business that would allow you to have clients, then you may be better off interviewing people who may not be quote unquote big names like New York Times bestselling authors, for example, but who have more chances to maybe become clients of yours after the interview has been done.
Great advice. Great advice. And that's actually part of the reason why I am doing a mixture of solo episodes and interviews. Because
Nice.
I personally, part of the reason why I started the podcast is because I was interested in, how other people are doing things for their show and how it's impacting their business and what kind of things I can learn from that to build my own.
Right.
But on the flip side, I also realized that, in order to build authority, I have to do the solos as much as I hate it.
And it's scary. And I'm not going to lie, it's scary because you kind of can't rely on anybody but yourself. And I mean, we know we are our worst critic usually, but it definitely goes a long way. And yeah, I would invite everybody, even those who are listening to you and I don't, who may be already hosting interview-based shows, I would invite them to consider perhaps adding solo episodes as a special. Maybe, okay, the first week of the month or the last week of the month is just you and the listener.
Right. Or even like every other month or every other week.
Yeah.
To build some sort of a consistent pattern.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think as long as you make things clear, you share it, listeners are going to be on your side. I don't think people are going to say, well, I'm going to stop listening to your show because you used to have guests and now every now and then there is no guests. I mean, if you have listeners who would tell you like that, then you want them to run the other way because as I said early on, you are the common denominator. You're the one who's always there. Guests come and go, but you as the host are always there.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to let me interview you today.
It's been my pleasure. As I said, I mean, you admitted it. You have been stalking me. No, I've been really, really happy when somehow I made that connection that, so that's Dawn. And I was, really thrilled to be here. This has been a lot of fun, really refreshing conversation as well, because I don't get to discuss podcast interviews from both sides of the mic like we did today. So I'm really, really glad that we did it, and especially to have done it with you. So thank you again, Dawn.
Well, thank you. So what is coming up for you?
Ooh, well, there is a lot coming up, really a lot. I've been planning a bunch of different things, and I think if I were to start sharing the list, we would be here the entire quarter. So I would say this, for all the people who are kind of curious to hear more about this macaroni accent guy and what he's working on, but more importantly, to connect with me, with you, Dawn, and with thousands of other podcasters, podcast fans, and people in the podcasting industry, I would like to invite everybody to join the Podcast Growth Mastermind, which is actually the Facebook group I run and that you and I, Dawn, are both part of. So I would say if anybody is interested, maybe they have questions about being the host, being the guest, about my funny accent, anything at all, I would invite everybody to go to yannilunga.com/community. So that's YANNILUNGA.com/community. so yannilunga.com/community. So that's the best place to connect with me, with Don, with everybody, and to basically still answer your question, Don. I've been redesigning from scratch my membership site, which is going to be online very soon. So I'm really, really excited about that because it's been a lot of work. Members really enjoyed it before it went under renovation. But I think that after the new version is online, they're going to love it. And it's been really a rebranding in terms of new user experience, new platform, new name as well, because I wanted to put more emphasis on helping podcasters and podcast guests with the growth side of things. So more on that will be coming out soon in the Podcast Growth Mastermind Facebook group I mentioned early on over at yannilunga.com/community.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Yann, for joining me today on Podcast Rockstars.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks for tuning in to Podcast Rockstars, sponsored by Lidwell Writing Services, because a great podcast deserves great show notes. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes and leave us a review, and remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Join our exclusive Podcast Rockstars Facebook community to connect with other podcasting legends. In the Facebook community, you can ask your most pressing questions and tell us who you would love to hear on the show. And if you're ready to experience the power of great show notes, contact Don at lidwellwriting.com.